Welcome everyone to Ceding Sovereignty to the More Than Human, a Maori perspective by Professor Carl Mika. This is an Identities and Global Studies in Culture and Power event at Glasgow University in collaboration with Lancaster University and Glasgow Caledonian University. I'm Ema Jackson. I'm a Professor of Community Engagement and Research, and I've been invited to chair this session and in research, social policy and infrastructure development. I've worked a long time with communities adversely racialized to bring their experiences, knowledges, and expertise into the research that is most usually done about them, not with them. It has been a career-long, complex relationship with the academy, and I've continuously sought to engagement with creatives and philosophers, and especially value the critical creative thinking artists bring to understand the complexity when working with systemic racism and the enduring impacts of colonization and racialization. Some of these creators are here today. More recently, I've engaged with philosophers such as Professor Christina Sharp, and through the work of Ibrahim Mahama, the work of Karikachi Sidu at Kwame Nkrumah University of Technology in Kumasi, of who I was there last month. And I'm very grateful also to the work of philosopher Dr. Gabrielle Beckers-Raymond, who rolled up their philosophical sleeves to support our collective thinking here in Scotland as a beautiful team, a brilliant team of community and academic experts crashed into systemic racism and violence as our invite to build Scottish government-funded national anti-racism infrastructure for Scotland became vigorously and aggressively resisted by the system. This type of work that we do here spans data, health, creative sector, education and employability. So I was delighted to hear Professor Carl Mika coming to the UK, and it was through Tamsin Hong, who is a contemporary international art curator at the Serpentine in London. We also have with us here Harani Himona, Executive Director of the Te Tuhi Arts, is one of New Zealand's foremost contemporary art spaces and leader in experimental practice, and it has a stated commitment to addressing structural racism in the arts and beyond. We also have Carl Cheetham, a Director of Dow's Art Museum, one of the country's leading contemporary art galleries, and thank you for being here too. Such brilliance coming to Glasgow. So before I can introduce Carl, I have give thanks to Professor Nasser Mir and Michaela Broadbent for supporting and organising through the platform offered through Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, which explores the formation and transformation of racial, ethnic and transnational post-colonial studies, identities in the contemporary world. It locates culture, representation and identities as key sites for processes of domination, struggle and resistance, recognizing their intersection with other forms of social division and identification. Identities provides an interdisciplinary space for new theoretical informed empirical research and critical analysis, which opens up questions of race, ethnicity and culture. And actually it's for that reason that I brought this top cover, the table cover, which is Aseoke from Nigeria, which is from Yoruba, and it's known originally as Ofi, and it's hand-woven cloth. And it was recently, while I was there to be with family in that diasporic, disconnected, complicated, but not so very unusual way, and the colours also relate to Ireland, which is also part of my identity. I brought it today as it represents, for me, a sort of materiality that's related to the ideas of oneness which Professor Mika talks of. So Carl himself, Carl Mika, Professor, is head of school and Professor of Maori and Indigenous Studies in Aotearoa School in Maori and Indigenous Studies, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. His research has spanned law, philosophy and Maori and Indigenous Studies, often focusing on their overlap. Currently, he is speculating on a Maori colonized existentialism in light of the idea that all things are interconnected. Come in. He has written books and several articles and chapters relating to Maori and Indigenous philosophies, including in education-related contexts, as well as German Romanticism, Martin Heidegger, and the overall ethics and methodological possibilities of working alongside non-Indigenous philosophies. He's been adjunct professor at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, and an investigator on international philosophies, projects funded by the Swedish Research Council and Social Sciences and Humanitarian Research Council Canada. He's also been investigator for several New Zealand-based funded researchers. I understand you're part of the New Zealand presentation at the 2026 Venice Biennale, which is starting 9th away. So can we give a warm welcome to Professor Carl Mika? For about 40 to 50 minutes.
And if I go over, feel free to
Thank you.
let me know. Kia ora tātou, tēnei te mea atu kia koutou, kua haramai nei tēnei wā. Whakamihi tuatai ki rātai noa ko haere ki te pō, tuara te whenua e takapō nei tēnā koe, koe anō me mihi nāne kia koutou kua haramai. Tēnā rā koutou katoa. So what I just did was give a what we call a greeting to the land here and the people who have passed away and the people who are here. And that's how we normally start something like this. We don't always do it, but often we do. And I felt that I should do that today. And I also want to acknowledge the Identities folk, those people who have invited me here today, Ima, Nasa, Michaela. Thank you so much for your invitation and your hospitality. It means a lot to be able to come here and talk to you about this sort of thing. We don't get much chance to do that from the other side of the globe, so thank you so much for inviting me here today. My talk might take various pathways depending on how it goes. It's very Deleuzian of me. I'm not a Deleuzian, but we'll see where it goes. And I mean, if you have any questions while I'm going along, please feel free to ask them rather than waiting to the end if you really want to. If you want to make any comments or if you want to just ask a question, please feel free. So my talk today is Ceding Sovereignty to the Northern Human and Maori perspective. I should probably say also the state where I'm from, and that is the territories around Te Aroa, which is a tribal area within the North Island of New Zealand, and also the Hauraki area, which is also a little bit further north from there. I don't know if it means New Zealand, but you know, it's all in the North Island there. So that kind of situates where I'm from originally. Now, I will assume that some of you may know about who the Maori are, and others of you may not. So I'm going to assume that many of you don't, and I want to give some context for some of the things we've been struggling for since colonisation occurred. Maori are the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, which is the Maori term for New Zealand. Well, we're roughly 18% of the population, which is, you know, when compared to other indigenous peoples, it's a sizable proportion. We, like other indigenous peoples, our struggles have been largely, I mean, they've been on multiple fronts, but notable among those are language, which is known as te reo. It's a Māori name for land, which is known as whenua. Whenua also refers to placenta, by the way, and culture generally. But particularly, I would say language and land have been focal since the 1970s. The Māori ownership of land dwindled hugely from the 1860s onwards. And with that went, you know, you can imagine that if you lost your land base, then you lose your language base as well. And various other things started to happen, like a drop in Māori health, a rise in incarceration of Maori. This is very typical amongst other Indigenous peoples as well. So we have a lot in common with other Indigenous peoples. I think to some extent we've retained aspects, we've retained our language perhaps a little bit better than others. We were just talking today on the train on the way up that we got a lot of our inspiration to preserve the language from Wales, and especially around the teaching of the young ones. So we have language nests now, which we call them language nests, which are for preschoolers. We've had them for a while actually. And I understand that that was actually an inspiration that was taken from the Welsh experience. I've got one thing here, because I've named it, I've identified it because it's something that I've been involved with as well when I was practicing as a lawyer, and that's the Waitangi Tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal was something that was established in 1975 to hear grievances against the Crown from Maori, and the 1970s was a key period for Maori struggle. That's when Maori sort of thought, oh, we've had enough, and so we started to fight back against particularly the loss of land and language. So the Maori Land March also in 1975 happened, where several thousand Maori started right from the top of the North Island, and in fact I've got a picture there of the start of it. That old woman started the march, and I think that's great-grandchild or grandchild, I think it might be great-grandchild, that is the very beginning of the march at the top of the North Island of New Zealand, and they made their way down, got bigger and bigger, right down to Wellington, which is where Parliament is based, and a petition was presented to Parliament. But what I was going to say was the Waitangi Tribunal was enacted in 1975, and that was, that's been a very interesting, I think it's quasi-judicial structure, because it's had to both juggle the expectations of the judicial system, or the legal system rather, but also try and cater for Māori custom and Māori thought. Two notable examples. So what happens is you present a case to the Waitangi Tribunal and it gets heard. And there were two cases, one in the 1980s and one more recently, which were interesting for the fact that they involved so-called intangible things that were precious to Māori. One of them was language, and the Crown argued to the Waitangi Tribunal that they weren't allowed to hear, or that the claim should fail. So the claim was about Māori grievance around the language not having been protected. And the Crown came back in that case and said, sorry, language is not tangible. Language is intangible, and so therefore it's not covered by something that I won't go into. And the Crown pushed back. The Waitangi Tribunal found in favour of Māori. And since then there has been some renaissance and revitalisation of the language. And another one involved cultural and intellectual property. That is a very interesting case about healing, particularly around healing, also trademarks. That claim was filed in 1992 and wasn't resolved until, I think, 2011, so it took 20 years. And that's because you're dealing with knowledge. I think it was because it was huge, and you're also dealing with this intangible thing called knowledge. And just while I'm on that terminology, in Māori worldview, this is largely about Māori worldview, but I'm providing some context politically and socially at the moment. There is no such thing as tangible and intangible. Things simply are. That's a Western imposition, or a colonised imposition, this idea of tangible and intangible. I'm not aware of any word that makes such a stark division, or reifies that binary within Māori thought. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding. And certainly arguments around Māori worldview propose that there is no such thing as that division. So, for instance, we believe that our ancestors are just as tangible as we are, and they are around us all the time. So even death and life, there's another false binary. I will come back to some of that stuff as we go along. But in relation to that actually, one often neglected aspect of colonisation is the introduction of the word of separability, including the idea that the self is separable from everything else. And being in the discipline I suspect that many of you are, you will be familiar with where that all comes from. It's the usual suspects, Descartes. We go there. We'll go directly there. But also, you go further back, and I think it probably started in the ancient Greeks as well. And in the 1980s and 1990s, it was quite common to hear the arguments against separability from older Maori authors, usually. One notable one was someone called Maori Marsden, who was a theologian, but also a philosopher. And he argued that actually Maori worldview was very, very much focused or founded on the idea that everything is interconnected. And what I've noticed is since the 90s, this is not something that I can sort of verify, but since the 90s, Māori scholarship will often mention that fact, but they won't stay in the area as much as someone like Maori Marsden did. And what I'm saying there is that research has tended to identify something like dreadful health statistics amongst Māori, diabetes, lung cancer, whatever, or dreadful incarceration rates amongst Māori, criminal statistics, whatever, bad Māori achievement and so on. And they, you would look at scholarship and it will tend to mention that the world is interconnected. But what strikes, it's obviously important, but what strikes me is that that is never, very rarely a topic on its own merit. Staying with that non-empirical idea that behind every aspect of everyday life is something that can't be seen, but structures everyday life, the empirical world. There is where I am focusing, and it's been something that I've always been fascinated by actually, but I've become more fascinated since I did my PhD 13 years ago. But let's talk a little bit more about separability. I call it separability, you could also call it fragmentation, but separability is the word I settled on. Maori Marsden, who I mentioned before, identifies that rational thought and empirical methods can't approximate Maori thought. And I'm really fascinated by that at the moment because I'm aware that there is a need for a set of Maori foundational modes of assessment, or even a version of, or versions of criticality or critical analysis that actually are irrational, but are somewhat based on the Māori worldview. Because critical thinking or critical reasoning to me operates from the idea that things are separable and highly clarifiable. And we wouldn't necessarily have advocated that, because to do that is to alienate things in the world from the self, and actually that would mean that the self is lifted above the things so that they can do that kind of stuff. And that would be, I would imagine, I can't say, I wasn't there, but pre-colonially would have been something that would have been, wouldn't have been encouraged, put it that way. Separability means that we're taught to focus on a thing in the world as if it is alone. And the outcome of that, and you, as I said before, you'll know that this is true for Descartes and a whole lot of other people. Some of the influential ones, such as Immanuel Kant and so on, that the human being determines the outcome of everything. They structure everything, and reality becomes something which is an extension of the mind. And what else I've noticed, in this whole focus of mine, is that, and this then comes to bear on what happens with us when we are writing about this area, is that there's a lack of language available to not only express the identity of something being interconnected, really, but there's a lack of way to show how everything or the interconnection drives the question and drives your answer through writing. So the more you talk about it, the more you describe it within your academic work, the more unethical you become, because you're not actually demonstrating that powerful interconnection in the structure of your work. And the other thing is I've always been fascinated by, it related to that I've always been fascinated by the structures that underpin but can't be seen. And my work on one version of Maori metaphysics is interconnection, but within that I can see two, possibly three versions of interconnection. One is, and this is by far the most common in Indigenous writing, I think, that everything in the world is interconnected, including things we can't see. And it's interconnected on a sort of a web of energy, spiritual energy, if you want to call it, if you want to use another false binary. So that invigorates and interconnects and makes everything related. The other one, which is the one I prefer because it's more radical, is that everything is completely one. And I say it's radical because it's actually completely antithetic to the separability that I identified before. The other possible one that I've realised that I act out within my writing more recently is that there's a kind of a conflict between, but a necessarily corresponding relationship between everything is one, but we talk about something separately. And that creates tensions and sparks as an Indigenous person for the next flow of thinking. I'm talking about academic work here. And I actually really like that idea. I like the idea that the separability and the fullness of the one can operate exactly and immediately at the same time. And actually you can bring separability into service to your proposition about oneness or the all. It's really important for Indigenous peoples to be talking about philosophy, particularly for me, and I would say this because I'm working in the area of metaphysics. Because I think, everything that goes on that relates, that we identify as a problem, can be sourced in the idea of separability. Probably, in some form or other, you could probably stretch it back to that. And what I will talk about today is some more around this Māori worldview. And then I was going to give you an example that I sometimes give with one word, which is the word for water and who at the same time, which is why. And it's an important word for us because obviously when you're asking who someone is, you are also asking something about water to do with them. Right. Okay. Now, some themes on interconnection from a Māori perspective. We have various terms that would suggest that there is a oneness of work. One of them is tangata whenua, which means the person is the earth is the person. And it's often used to identify or talk about or label the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. I am tangata whenua. That's what one would say. I am a person of the earth. But the way Charles Royal or Te Ahenakew Royal, as he's also known as, identified it or described it, is that you are immediately that and the other thing is immediately you, such that you are indivisible from each other. So we have a sovereignty, and I deliberately chose that word sovereignty because I've become somewhat fatigued by the way sovereignty is used in relation solely to people. And what I wanted to do was deliberately use the term so that it identified the sovereignty of the more than human over the human world. But I'm not going to get into the whole sovereignty discourse because I think that would be a bit of a distraction here. But just when I use the word sovereignty, I'm talking about dominion over. And so we've got here tangata and whenua, human and earth, coexisting or being one. And in Māori, again in Māori thought, when you pick up any bit of Māori scholarship, you're bound to see usually that interconnection acts in a way such that the human being is not superior to other things in the world. The human being has to act in conjunction with the world and has some degree of agency, but even that agency is dictated by the more than human. It's structured by the more than human. Even our decision-making processes and emotions, our thoughts, are not just our own. They are, we are indebted to the more than human world for those. And I've said before that all things, we're talking about the all. We're not just talking about tangible objects, we're also talking about intangible. And when I talk about interconnection, I'm very much aware that we may not have talked about that traditionally. We may have, but I would imagine that it would have driven so much of everything that may not have been any need to talk about it. I have a quote here which talks about interconnection in the first way that I identified, I think, more than the way I tend to think about it, and that is that interconnected phenomena thing on a field of energy. So he says that in Māori, and then I've translated there. The forms of the world are amazing. The movement of the sun, the lapping of the tide, the darkness and the light. These manifestations of the world are amazing to see. I think what he's trying to get at there, because anyone could say that actually and be in awe of the world, but what he's trying to say there, I think, is the insignificance of the human being in the face of those phenomena. And also that those phenomena, because you are awestruck by them, they have some sort of power over you. I also mentioned, on the basis of what you had mentioned, that discussions about the environment and Indigenous knowledge contributing to that have become much more important. We don't see it, we see it a little bit in education in New Zealand, I guess, that Māori thought is important. The law is trying to do it. Recently there was a case, fairly recently, like 8 years ago, where one of the rivers belonging to one of the tribal areas was given legal personhood in the courts. I don't know if you heard about that. And so the saying goes, I am the river and the river is me. It relates to the Whanganui River. Just as an aside there, one of my incidentals is that it's a big step in terms of the law, I think, to be able to do that. Like, the law finds it hard to do that sort of thing. But an Indigenous response to that would be, why are you suddenly seeing it as important simply because it's human? You know, giving it legal personhood doesn't have to be human in order to be important. And of course it does in the law. The other thing about this whole area is that I believe, because it connects so much to well-being, and I say that because there are various levels of well-being for the Māori self, and it's not just physical and emotional and mental, it's also spiritual. And I think that when you engage in separability, as you're forced to do, is a subtle but very overwhelming aspect of colonisation, then you are doing some sort of spiritual damage to the world and also to yourself. That's why I quite like Arola, who's also an Indigenous scholar from North America, though, who says that the intellectual and ethical maxim of the commitment to the belief that all things are related. The ethical is that we have to do it, really. We have to sustain it in various ways. So humility in the natural world, a traditional account I have here, a narrative from pre-colonial times about a character who went and felled a tree, and he forgot to say the appropriate karakia or prayers, and just went and did it, I think. And the natural world decided to teach him a lesson and re-establish the tree. re-erected it. And this is what they said. Rata was the name of the person who did it. Ignorant Rata, you took liberty and felled Tani, the god of the forest. Hear the thud, hear the sound of the ants, the chips fly hither, stick together, hold together. The fine chips fly hither, stick together, hold together, arise Tani and stand straight. Behold, he lives in you. So that is something that is often recounted in order to teach people the insignificance or the huge reliance of the human self on the natural world, let alone the supernatural world. And we have various entities or phenomena that establish interconnection. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about them because they are complex. Often, and I'm not saying you're like this, but often people assume that one of the aspects of colonisation is that apparently we didn't think very deeply, or we didn't think very well. But actually, when you dig down into these terms, they have some real complexity. And one of them is the first stage in many genealogies that we have is nothingness. And when you consider the idea that everything comes from nothing, and yet one possible aspect of time is that it's completely one and to do with the nowness, then that means that we are all established by nothingness here and now, even as I give this talk, even as you listen, that there are that everything is not completely visible and present for our consumption, if you like. Another one is gloom, darkness, or sadness. I've used both those terms more recently in my writing to undermine what I've just written in the sentence before, or in the paragraph before. Bless you. And I use them deliberately as systems or devices to show the sovereignty of the more than human world, if you like, over our writing and our thinking, and to show that everything, that if we've made something separable in our writing, that there's a possibility to go back and re-establish our lack of certainty. Are there any questions so far?
Is Maori language written?
It is now.
Yeah.
It wasn't. Wasn't pre-colonially. Yeah. Marama, this is one that we hear of often these days because I don't think that's incidental. I think that's a love of, can I say, enlightenment, both smallly and bigly. That we actually want to understand and know everything, and I suspect that it's overemphasised, and we've forgotten those other stages there. Apart from in ceremony, those are still important, particularly that one. The second one is important in ceremony. But if you look at government documents and you hear people talking generally, they will often refer to marama. We're in the world of the light. We're in the world of clarity. We've gone through this and now we're here, whereas I'm saying actually there's a combination of all those things at play. Another one that we have is Papa Tuanuku, which is the Earth Mother. A lot of Indigenous peoples refer to the Earth as Mother and the sky as Father. I'm not sure about those appellations. I'm wondering whether they're too gender specific. I'm a little bit sceptical of them. I think they're a little bit too clear cut by those genderisings, and I would like to think that actually, because they were actually initially one, that they retain still the other within them. So I won't go into those in a lot more detail, but one word that relates to Mother Earth is whakapapa or genealogy, and I'll put genealogy with a question mark there because again it's my scepticism of our language, because it can also mean to layer, it can also mean a conceptual and material becoming or establishment of the human being, and so it is a kind of a genealogy. And what I found this in my critique of the interplay between Maori and English translations between them, is that you can find a kernel of truth in a translation, but it's not confined to that English definition. You can say, yeah, it exists there, but there's an excess or a spiritual aura, if you like, of the Maori term, which we have to acknowledge as well, which exists quite apart from that somewhat true translation. So in other words, it's reductionist. But it's spiritually reductionist as well, it's not just linguistically. So the all is everything that has ever existed, does exist, and ever will. It includes apparently invisible realms as well as visible. I don't think there's anything there, or anything there that I have to go into. What's our timeline?
To leave half an hour, there's 10 minutes.
Okay, so let's skip to this word why that I talked about. Why means it wants who and water, and when you ask who someone is, you ask ko waikoi, who are you? But again and again, that is not incorrect, but it's only part of the story. It doesn't account for the more than human in a way that we would like translation to do that. When we give formal introductions, I didn't do this today. I often personally don't do this, but I mean I can't remember the last time I did it. But you know I can. You have there's a structure to how you personally identify yourself, or you can be. You would probably start with your mountain. You would talk about your river, your tribal river. You would talk about your tribal lake or ocean within your territory. You would say what your tribal area is, and then you would say who you are. The reason I put that in there is it shows immediately because you were last, you were least important of those things. But yet they constitute you because everything is one. And so what you're doing is identifying the thing that you know to be constituting yourself, which is your own natural features in your tribal area. Water, why? It is an element or essence that permeates the sky, the earth, and everything created from it. The Te Aroha Lakes Trust offers that water is central to life. It symbolises the lifeblood of the Earth Mother and the tears of the Sky Father. It is the element that binds the physical and spiritual realms together. And another explanation is upper level elements can continually cascade through the layers of the universe and take form or manifest within the earthly physical realm as the energies of water flow through the layers of cosmology to be drawn in with the breath. So it starts from this what I've called an inundation, starts from outside the earth. It starts from the all and establishes life. And so it's not just about water. And I want, if there's something I'd like you to hold, but we don't have to go into a lot of detail about this, but it's your skepticism of language and translations as an undermining of through colonising thought, that water is simply, or why is simply the physical element of water. As these people are saying, it actually starts from outside of that. It includes water, for sure, but it's much bigger than that. Any questions as I career through this last bit at an obscene pace, where I try and talk about Maori thought in relation to metaphysical why within 5 minutes? No?
What is the complication of the word why? We're using it as food and water, and in a linguistic, dialogue or conversation. Does that create any difficulties, or how do people differentiate?
Yeah, because well, as I'm going to go on and say, there's attempts to try and bring them together in their translations. My worry is that when we ask, who are you now, we are simply asking, who are you? There's no excessive inundation or water, what I call water within the statement. We don't intend that. So that I think is a bit of a problem. And I've got here another explanation about, close to what I'm talking about, I think. Maori knowledge flows from the cosmos, the stars. When you drink the water, remember the spring. Who are you? Who am I? I am water. So we see there that it's bigger than the physical element, the tangible element. And going back to your question, one way that people translate ko waikoe, rather than saying who are you, because that's insufficient, is which waters do you come from? Or which waters establish you? I haven't heard that, but actually if I think about it, it would be something along those lines. But let's go back to this notion of the all and start to think about it, reinterpret, and this is a counter-colonial thing that we need to do, I believe. We need to go back and re-establish, reinterpret everything that we do, if we're going to kind of try and be counter-colonial in our stance. And it's very, very difficult to do, obviously, and I wouldn't know how to do it completely, but I can do it a little bit through language. And so let's reiterate the importance of reinterpreting our world through a metaphysical stance as a counter-colonial act. Let's go back to the word why. And I do, in doing this, I do get some support and consolation from certain Maori researchers who identify that the word why breaks down into wa and e, the letter I, but you would say e. And wa means time and space, and e means located in the rag. So that the idea is that why, alongside being water, or perhaps like water, represents the complete nowness of the one in time and space, such that things take form. They're given permission to be, including the human being. And, it merges into the concern of the human being. When I was thinking of writing a book on this topic and using why as a basis for a Māori notion of inquiry and going to talk about what a Māori criticality might look like, using the term as a foundation, but I'm not sure if I made it. And so now what I'm going to do is give some very, very wordy alternatives for translations of ko waikoe. One of them begins, how is it that the all floods and makes manifest entities, including yourself? And so what I'm saying is, who are you, with much more of an emphasis on the contingent all. Another one is, the all inundates me and all other things, and my regard for you also in your overwhelming presence takes place through the contingent all. I mean, to me it sounds a little bit, it's dreadfully wordy.
No,
But,
where did these come from? Where's this come from?
well, actually, I think I've got them in one of my publications, but they're from me. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do is say that one of the things I'm trying to do here is say these nice economical translations are hurting the Māori world, and you've got to be suspicious of them, right? And this one is a real doozy. What is it about the all's manifestation in the form before me that resonates with me or has brought me to inquire into that form or thing? How are we given manifestation through this thing before me that I have a concern about? How is my own manifestation as the all brought into wa, nowness, itself by its congealing form? So when you ask ko waikoe, all those sorts of questions could actually be equally as relevant as asking simply, who are you? Okay, I did have this here. There are some other thoughts here that, as Māori academics, I think there's a real challenge here for us to try and represent something quite anti-logic in our writing and show another story in the way we write. I'm specifically talking about writing here and publishing. Something that is almost nonsense to the Western canon would be quite interesting, but which nevertheless made sense to a Māori or Indigenous reader. Somehow told a story which conventional Western academia doesn't tend to show. Through perhaps what is not said in the article or the chapter. So anyway, that concludes my talk. Feel free to ask me any further questions. Kia ora.